Good afternoon, everyone. Please be seated. Routine proceedings. Introduction of bills. The honourable member for St. James. The honourable member for St. James, if you can unmute your mic.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move, seconded by the member for Kiwatnook, that the residential tenancies...
The honourable member for St. James, you're not wearing a tie for the dress code. So let's take a few seconds here to get you to organize yourself. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Deputy Speaker, is there leave of the House to come back to introduction of bills?
Is there leave to the House to come back to introduction of bills? After ministerial statements? Okay. Agreed to have the honourable member come back to have the introduction of bills after ministerial statements. Okay, now we'll go on to committee reports. Tabling of reports. Ministerial statements. The Honourable Deputy Premier, the required 90 minutes notice prior to routine proceedings was provided in accordance with Rule 26-2. Would the Honourable Deputy Premier go ahead on this statement?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to present this ministerial statement on behalf of the Minister of Health and Seniors Care, who has proclaimed May 3rd through 9th as Heart Failure Awareness Week in Manitoba. Heart Failure Awareness Week is observed across Canada to raise awareness of the causes of heart failure and the impact it has on individuals living with heart failure and their caregivers. There are over 600,000 people in Canada living with heart failure, which affects people of all ages, Mr. Deputy Speaker. People with heart failure experience debilitating symptoms such as shortness of breath, swelling, and exhaustion. Sadly, those individuals who are caring for loved ones with heart failure are often overwhelmed and stressed. The Canadian Heart Failure Society is an organization of volunteer cardiovascular professionals and patients who work to improve care for patients with heart failure in close collaboration with the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, the Canadian Council of Cardiovascular Nurses, the Canadian Association of Cardiovascular Prevention and Rehabilitation, the Heart Life Foundation, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, and the Quebec Heart Failure Society. Heart Failure Awareness Week was initiated by the Canadian Heart Failure Society and its partner organizations and is now marked across Canada as a time dedicated to improving awareness and education on heart failure for Manitobans and for all Canadians, Mr. Deputy Speaker. On behalf of the Government of Manitoba, we would like to thank the Heart and Stroke Manitoba and the Heart and Failure Awareness Committee of Manitoba for their dedicated efforts to bring awareness to this important issue and improve the lives of Manitobans coping with heart failure. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The honourable member for Union Station.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, next week is the 3rd annual National Heart Failure Awareness Week hosted by the Canadian Heart Failure Society along with their partner organizations and a committee of cardiovascular professionals. Many Manitobans know and love someone who's experienced heart failure. It's a term used to describe a heart that isn't pumping as well as it should to get the body the oxygen it needs. Many people with heart failure can continue to live active, fulfilling lives as long as proper precautions are taken, such as taking heart failure medications and making healthy lifestyle choices. Another perspective was offered to me by a friend who lives with heart failure and describes it as a pain. They can't get enough blood to their extremities, it inhibits mobility, it affects a person's mental health, and there is little that can be done treatment-wise other than invasive surgery. The Canadian Heart Failure Society provides opportunities for professionals to exchange ideas and knowledge, but also they provide guidance for Canadian professionals and communities in order to address the risks of complications regarding heart failure. Now, not only does it have adverse effects on people's health, but it also causes increased financial strain on healthcare systems. It's therefore even more important to ensure that our healthcare providers are raising awareness about heart failure and that their patients and community members are provided with relevant, culturally appropriate, and holistic information that allows them to take the necessary steps to prevent it. Heart Failure Awareness Week is particularly relevant this year, as COVID-19 has left many people with permanent damage to their heart, lungs, and other internal systems. Unfortunately, the Palliser government has made it harder for Manitobans to access emergency care by closing several ERs, which has overwhelmed the capacity of the remaining ERs and led to the resurgence of hallway medicine. They've also left 1,300 nurse positions vacant in Winnipeg alone, and they failed to produce any plan to address rural and northern vacancies.
The honourable member's time is up.
Leave.
Leave to have the member continue with their statement. No, declined. That provision declined. The honourable member for River Heights.
Yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I ask leave to respond to the minister's statement.
Does the honourable member for River Heights have leave to reply to the ministerial statement? Agreed, and so ordered. The honourable member for River Heights.
Yeah, Mr. Deputy Speaker, your heart pumps blood around your body so that your tissues can get oxygen and so that you can live. Based on national numbers, it's estimated that about 20,000 Manitobans live with heart failure. It's an important condition to be aware of. I join others today to raise awareness of heart failure. Its major causes include coronary artery disease, high blood pressure, faulty heart valves, cardiomyopathy, arrhythmia, among others. Important risk factors for the development of heart failure include, as examples, having a heart attack, having sleep apnea, having obesity. Prevention of heart failure is primarily about reducing risk factors, including reducing smoking, controlling high blood pressure, preventing diabetes, and keeping diabetes in individuals who have this condition under good control. Keeping physically active, eating healthy foods, and reducing and managing stress and treating arrhythmia. Let us work closely with the Canadian Heart Failure Society to create better awareness of heart failure and its causes and its prevention. And let us take a more vigorous approach to preventing heart failure, as well as providing excellent treatment for those who have it. Thank you. Merci, miigwech.
The Honourable Minister. Order. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health, Wellness and Recovery on a different ministerial statement.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, the required 90 minutes prior to routine proceedings was provided in accordance with Rule 26-2. Would the Honourable Minister please proceed with her statement?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I would like to acknowledge that next week, May 3rd to 9th, is the Canadian Mental Health Association's 70th Annual Mental Health Week. CMHA's Mental Health Week helps to raise awareness and promote the importance of mental health. Our government understands that mental health is just as important as physical health, and we know that many people are struggling with the additional pressures caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. That is why our government created the Ministry of Mental Health, Wellness and Recovery, to help ensure Manitobans have access to the care, supports, and treatments they need on their journey towards wellness, recovery, and healing. In Budget 2021, we also made an initial investment of $342 million in funding for wellness and recovery programs. The theme of Mental Health Week this year, Understanding Our Emotions, encourages people to come together to start talking about our emotions, the good and the bad. That is why we believe it is especially important to recognize our emotions and #GetReal about how you feel during Mental Health Week. I would like to highlight some of the mental health programs and services available to Manitobans through our investment of $50.2 million in 30 initiatives. Enhancements to mental health and specialized trauma services have been implemented at the Laurel Centre and Clinic Community Health Centre. These services help individuals Mr. Deputy Speaker, address the trauma they have experienced, often resulting in decreased substance use, improved mental health, and higher quality of life. Expanding the distribution of Thrival kits in schools for grades 4 to 6 students. The kits incorporate evidence-based mental health practices such as mindfulness, meditation, personal reflection, stress reduction, and coping strategies, as well as interpersonal skills development. I encourage all Manitobans to get involved by using the hashtags Mental Health Week and Get Real. For more information on Mental Health Week, visit the website mentalhealthweek.ca. This Mental Health Week, don't be uncomfortably numb. Get real about how you feel and name it, don't numb it. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The honourable member for Point Douglas.
Miigwech, Deputy Speaker. This past year has shone a light on the mental health of Manitobans as we've all had to navigate the difficulty of the pandemic. Some of us have lost loved ones to the virus, others lost their job or business, and all of us have struggled in one way or another with isolation from family and friends. Everyone processes these traumas differently. Some of us get angry and irritated, others face depression, and some begin to feel numb and apathetic. For this year's Mental Health Week, the Canadian Mental Health Association doesn't want people to be uncomfortably numb about their emotions. They want them to #get real about how they feel. Rather than burying their emotions inside, the Canadian Mental Health Association is encouraging Canadians to open up and talk about how they're feeling. While talking about our feelings is very important, we know that it too often takes more than that to deal with mental health challenges. Poor mental health outcomes are deeply linked to poverty, addictions, trauma, and housing. We know that overdose deaths tragically increased by 87% in our province in 2020, and there is no doubt linked to the pandemic and the strain it's placed upon Manitobans' mental health. The appropriate response is not to simply call it a tragedy, but to take action that tackles the root causes of the addictions crisis. Unfortunately, this government has refused to invest in safe consumption sites. They've sold off hundreds of affordable housing units, and they have cut healthcare services. Manitobans deserve better. In times of intense anxiety and stress, such as this pandemic has been, it's especially important to protect our mental health. I hope all Manitobans will join me for the 70th annual Canadian Mental Health Week next week from May 3rd to the 9th. And remember to name it, don't numb it, and to #get real about how you feel. Miigwech, Deputy Speaker.
The honourable member for Tyndall Park.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I ask for leave to respond to the minister's statement.
Does the honourable member for Tyndall Park have leave to reply to the ministerial statement? Agreed. So ordered. The honourable member for Tyndall Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm finding now more than ever throughout this pandemic that people have been reaching out, expressing their concerns and identifying their own mental health needs that aren't being met. This last introduction of restrictions have created quite the stir, and I've been hearing about the toll these restrictions have been taking on people's mental health. I do want to emphasize that I strongly believe we need these restrictions, and I'm hopeful that if we follow them over the next few weeks, it will mean that we'll have a little more normalcy come the summer. Now, Mr. Speaker, over the last 5 years, I've been finishing my master's in marriage and family therapy. Through my education, my own experience, and through what I've been hearing from my constituents, I know it is absolutely critical that we as elected officials better promote what can be done to help everyone who may be struggling or who may know someone struggling with their mental health. There are 4 supports that I want to mention. First, never ever underestimate the basics. Make sure you're getting good sleep, eating healthy food, getting some fresh air, maintaining healthy hygiene, and communicating with people, even over online platforms. Secondly, there are resources here in Manitoba to be used. We have therapy and counseling resources, support groups, local services, phone and text resources, apps, and many various streams and methods where trained professionals can help. Thirdly, we as elected officials could be doing more too. We should have paid sick leave so people do not have to choose between potentially spreading COVID and being able to pay for rent. We should have affordable and available childcare for those having to work through the pandemic. And we should have therapeutic services covered under healthcare and not just during the pandemic. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about self-care. I personally have found solace in art and nature throughout the pandemic, and others have found it in music, baking, cooking, bubble baths, bonfires, physical fitness. The list is really endless. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I want to be a little bit bossy here. I don't want people to only identify forms of self-care. I want people to actually practice their self-care. Talk about your self-care with each other. Post about it. The more open we are about how we are taking care of our mental health, the more we're going to practice it and remove the stigma behind it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Now we'll go back to the introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for St. James.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Sorry about the mix-up there. I'm happy to report I had my shot today, and I forgot to put my tie back on after that was done. So thanks to the amazing healthcare workers who took good care of me there. So I move, seconded by the member for Kiwatnook, that bill number 227. Oh, God.
Order. The Honourable Member for St. James again. Can you repeat that?
Sure. I move, seconded by the member for Kiwatnook, that bill number 227, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act, loi modifiant la loi sur la location à usage d'habitation, be now read for a first time.
It has been moved by the Honourable Member for St. James, seconded by the Honourable Member for Transcona, that bill number 227, the Residential Tenancy Amendment Act, be now read for the first time. The Honourable Member for St. James.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am honored to present Bill 227, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act, to this House to help better protect renters from above guideline rent increases in Manitoba. Bill 227 will help to mitigate rent evictions and tenants being hit with large rent increases for work that is simply needed ongoing maintenance. In those situations where above guideline increases are still needed, Bill 227 will provide means to limit the immediate financial impact on renters by allowing the increase to be phased in over a period of time to ensure greater affordability for renters. Bill 227 is necessary as 100% of above guideline increases are being approved, and renters are now about to face increased costs on their property taxes. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Agreed, and agreed and so ordered. Now we'll go on to member statements. The Honourable Minister for Infrastructure.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the constituency of Springfield-Richard is filled with incredible people who have dedicated their lives to serving the community. Today, I am honored to recognize Laurie Kyle, who has been volunteering within the community of Springfield for 54 years and counting. Ever since the volunteering bug hit Laurie in 1966, he can't help but give his time away to others. In the words of Laurie, 54 years came and went like that. It didn't even feel like work. It was a way of life. Laurie has worn many hats in many communities throughout his decades of volunteerism. He volunteered all throughout the rural municipality of Springfield, including the Springfield Curling Club, the Costume Museum of Canada, and the Springfield Archives. These are just to name a few. He has been part of the National Parole Board of Canada, and in 2019 was awarded Volunteer of the Year by the board of the Oakbank Springfield Kinsman Seniors Complex. I have seen Laurie on a hot summer's day helping at the annual country fair held by the Springfield Agricultural Society in Dugald. People from far and wide also enjoy his acting talents in the annual Oakbank Dinner Theatre, which is not just a fundraising event for his church, but also a must-see for many Manitobans. Laurie was instrumental in organizing the creation of 71 seniors housing units in Oakbank and was involved in planning the first phase of the Dugald Estates. Although there's not enough time in the day to go through Lori Kyle's entire exceptional history of volunteerism, I hope that I at least scratch the surface of his extraordinary life of community service. While there are many remarkable volunteers throughout this province, there are few that have given as much to their community as Lori Kyle. Thank you to Lori Kyle and to all of the volunteers that make up our beautiful province. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The honourable member for the Paul Kamisak.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused an overall decline in mental health for a lot of people, including many Manitobans. The pandemic has been especially hard on students in Manitoba, given that many can't partake in the extracurriculars they love, such as sports or clubs. They aren't able to see many of their friends or family, and graduation for grade 12 students has been canceled yet again. I also know that remote learning has been stressful for many students, especially with all of the technical difficulties I'm sure we've all experienced at some point. Recognizing the students need mental health supports more than ever, grade 12 psychology students from Margaret Barber Collegiate Institute in the PAW decided to create a portable mental health kit for everyone in the school. These kits include a stone to rub away your worries, a balloon to blow your negative energy into and then release, an eraser to show it's okay to make mistakes, a toy to have fun and unwind with, tips on self-care, printed mental health sheets for additional coping mechanisms, and more. The students delivered 400 of these kits on March 23rd and the 24th to individual classes. These kits were purposely delivered around the time of the equinox, a culturally significant day for many that invokes a reawakening of everything in nature and a period of growth. These 400 kits were prepared and delivered by only 10 students, showing how much effort they all put to make a difference. These students also wanted to encourage our other students or organizations to complete similar projects to help improve their classmates' co-workers' sense of well-being. Please join me today in congratulating the grade 12 psychology students, Willow Rambo, Jeremiah Tomchuk, Jane Dunham, Michael Gueswin, Joseph Ducharme, Ella Nagel, Leah Yeager, Brendan Allen, Walter Bignoria, Sunny Demery, and on their outstanding work and great initiative. Ego Sem. Excuse me. I ask leave for
The honourable member for Lagimodiere.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I rise today to recognize Asian Heritage Month in Manitoba. I'm so proud to say that in 2017, our government formally recognized May as Asian Heritage Month in Manitoba, a time when we can reflect on and celebrate the contributions that Manitobans of Asian origin continue to make to the growth and prosperity of this province. For more than a century, people have come to Manitoba from all over Asia and have brought with them their rich cultural heritage, which represents many languages, ethnicities, and religious traditions. Manitoba continues to be the home of hope, and that is why so many come here from around the world to make this province their permanent home, one where they can have the opportunity to reach their full potential. The people of this vibrant and growing community have contributed to every aspect of life in Manitoba, from arts and science to sport, business, and government, the latter of which includes my esteemed colleague, the MLA for Waverly. Asian Heritage Month gives all Manitobans an opportunity to learn more about the history of Asian Canadians and celebrate their contributions to the growth and prosperity of our province of Manitoba. This celebration is a bridge that connects different societies so they may be able to better understand and learn from one another. Throughout the history of this province, Canadians of Asian descent, with their many achievements and contributions, have made and continue to make Manitoba an amazing place that has been and continues to be. I've had the honor to celebrate with many of these communities in the past and look forward to a time when we can do this again. My constituency of Lagimodiere and many constituencies across this province have a growing Asian and South Asian community. I call on all members to join me in recognizing and celebrating Asian Heritage Month this May, so we may honor Manitoba's Asian communities. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The honourable member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There are many people in Manitoba who have ensured life has continued for all of us throughout the pandemic. This includes people who work in transportation, whether it be a truck driver transporting goods and service, postal worker delivering our mail, transit driver ensuring our children arrive safely home, or a taxi driver taking us from one destination to another. The work of the transportation sector is essential to our community and economy. Unfortunately, transportation is a sector where we see an overrepresentation of COVID-19 cases, equaling 11% of all cases in the province. I would like to encourage all people in the sector to get vaccinated as soon as they can. Eligibility is now open to people aged 40 and over, and as well as First Nation people aged 30 and over. Also, there are some eligibility for people aged 18 and over who live or work in certain communities. More information can be found at protectmanitoba.ca. Lastly, Manitoba-based truck drivers have been given an opportunity to be vaccinated in North Dakota while completing their routine trips to and from the United States. This initiative makes upward of 4,000 truck drivers eligible for vaccination over the next several weeks. Further to this, the Ulster government should ensure people from out of province are vaccinated so that we can protect locals who work in the transportation as well as all Manitoban. I encourage truck driver, taxi drivers, and all the people in the transportation sector to be vaccinated as soon as possible. We thank you for your work you do and keeping our community safe. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I'm going to go back to the auto member for the Paul Kami section. Want to ask leave, I believe.
I wanted to ask leave, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to have the names put in Hansard. Thank you. That's
Okay, was there leave to have the names put in Hansard from the honourable member for the Paul Kamisak under a statement? Agreed and so ordered. Okay, now we'll go on to the honourable member for St. Boniface.
Speaker, I rise today to speak about the serious changes that Bill 64 makes to our public education system that will affect not just the 200,000 students who are currently in public schools, including my own children, but all future students. I want to highlight just how destructive this bill is for a part of the education system that changed my life, which is French immersion, which is at risk under this reform. Le projet de loi 64 crée l'illusion qu'il protège l'enseignement en français en épargnant à la division scolaire franco-manitobaine, ou TSFM, d'être oblitérée comme toutes les autres divisions scolaires. Mais l'immersion française est au-delà de ce que la TSFM offre. Je suis allé à l'immersion française dans la division scolaire de Winnipeg. Et mes enfants aussi. In 1996, the PC government of the day adopted a language addition to the Education Act that stated that French immersion, French first language, and basic French had the right to expect funding, programming, and curriculum appropriate to students, but instead, we've seen that the Bureau de l'Éducation française has been all but scrapped, and staff from the BEF who guarantee the quality of course content of French programming have been cut, eliminated, and ignored. We recognize that the more bilingual graduates Manitoba produces, the better our province will be able to compete. But Bill 64 does exactly nothing to guarantee that the students in our schools will have a quality education in both official languages. That is why Manitoba Liberals believe we should kill Bill 64. It's not reform, it's yet another act of political vandalism by a government that knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. We owe everyone in Manitoba a better education system than this.
Time for question period. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Throughout this pandemic, the Pallister government has continued to be reactive instead of proactive, and that continues on the issue of paid sick leave. We know that yesterday, premiers in British Columbia and in Ontario took concrete steps and announced specific proposals for paid sick leave in their provinces. Fast forward to today, what does the premier have? More delays, more words, but no action. Right. At this stage of the pandemic, we know that paid sick leave is an important part of the overall public health response to combating the third wave. Will the Premier simply implement a provincial comprehensive paid sick leave program today?
The Honourable First Minister.
Was sitting back saying nothing about it. We were proactive in advancing the idea of a national paid sick leave program. So the member's false in his assertions, and will continue to be assertive on this issue as soon as in the next hour and a half as we speak to the Prime Minister and other premiers about this issue.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplementary question.
Well, you know, with the Premier, it's always next hour. You know, the change we need, it's only a day away, as the musical said. We know that this Premier is continuing to looking for excuses rather than actually taking action. He has it within his power. He has the resources at his disposal to be able to implement a paid sick leave program that would be easily accessible to all workers, that would allow them to access it through their employers to ensure that there's no disruption of their incomes, and they would just simply see their incomes continue should they have to self-isolate or, God forbid, even become sick. Will the Premier stop with the excuses, put together a plan now, and ensure that every worker has access to comprehensive paid sick leave in Manitoba?
The Honourable First Minister.
Well, again, we've been advancing this cause for some months while the member was silent. He's got a cause celeb this week. He'll drop it and come up with something else next week. We all know that. The federal government assured us, all premiers, that they would advance a national sick leave program, and so the premiers took them at their word. They committed $5 billion to it. That was the promise. Then last week, we found out that the promise wasn't going to be kept the way it had been made, and they were down to less than a fifth of that money, and they put stipulations in the program they produced which give it some weaknesses and gaps, to say the least. But I'm not giving up on the Prime Minister at this point. We're talking to him this afternoon. We got him to change earlier on the issue of the wage subsidy program, where the feds came out and said 10% subsidy would be enough, and we fought them, and they went to 75. We made an improvement then. We're not giving up. And the member's about giving up. This government's not about giving up.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a final supplementary question.
And now apparently the Premier is going to insist that he invented the internet as well, I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Ontario announced their paid sick leave program yesterday. They introduced the legislation today. British Columbia introduced their proposal for paid sick leave programs. It's all well and good to have your ongoing dialogue with the Prime Minister, but the people of Manitoba deserve a leader who is going to take action now. Again, there is within the resources and within the powers of the Premier the ability to take action now. Will he do so? Will he take concrete steps immediately to ensure that there's a comprehensive provincial paid sick leave program right now? That's right.
The Honourable First Minister.
I invented it. He'd probably steal it, Mr. Speaker. And the fact is, we've been fighting for paid sick leave for a long time. So I just have to say to the member opposite, if he doesn't respect the Labour Management Review Committee and wants us to circumvent them, he's just gone on the record as saying so. I don't agree with him. So we've already initiated those discussions. We initiated those discussions last week. And we'll continue to advance ideas to fill in a gap, but we want the gap to be narrowed, not just in Manitoba, right across the country, because we think all Canadian workers deserve the kind of supports during this pandemic that will help them to feel safe and secure. And we're going to continue to fight for that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a different question.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, teachers are feeling insulted at this hour, even as we gather here. Now, the reason they're feeling so insulted is because it's not enough for the Premier to have returned hallway medicine to Manitoba. He's also now implemented his highway medicine plan for Manitoba teachers. That's right. He is telling Manitoba teachers to go to another province to get their vaccinations. He is telling Manitoba teachers to go to another country, rather, to go get their vaccinations. He is telling these Manitoba teachers that he doesn't want to prioritize them when it comes to the rollout of vaccines here in Manitoba. Instead, he sends them to the US of A. We know what is necessary to ensure that schools stay open, prioritizing teachers for vaccines in Manitoba immediately. Will the Premier comply?
The Honourable First Minister.
Well, you know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, all I can say is that we're not forcing anybody to get a vaccine, but we would encourage it. The member for St. John's has encouraged it. The member for Union Station has encouraged it, and I applaud them doing that. I think it's important. And we have an opportunity here. The United States has extra vaccines. North Dakota and Manitoba have, under this governor and this premier, a good relationship to work together. Right. And so if teachers want to get a little faster, get a vaccine, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So I would say to the member opposite, don't poo-poo initiative. You know, a minute ago he was pleading with us to have more initiative. Now we use the initiative and he doesn't like it. He could talk to any number of several hundred truckers and find out that it's a great appreciated initiative to be able to get a vaccine, and I think that a lot of teachers will appreciate it too. Hear, hear.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplementary question.
Well, the right plan would be to prioritize teachers for vaccines right here in Manitoba today. Instead, the Premier goes out and makes his announcement, and teachers are left wondering, is this some sort of bad joke? Yeah. Teachers are watching his press conference and they feel insulted. Again, the Premier is instituting a policy of highway medicine in Manitoba. He wants teachers to hit the road and get their vaccinations in another country. Again, we know that these teachers are important. We want the school kids across Manitoba to continue to receive education, but there are so many holes in this plan that it is hard to even take it seriously. Will the Premier abandon the folly of his press conference earlier today and simply prioritize all Manitoba teachers for vaccines in Manitoba?
Order. The Honourable First Minister.
Getting that we have, our vaccine team has made a genuine effort to make sure that in particular that teachers and educators, workers in our schools are able to get access, in particular in those hotspots that the member helped create by totally disrespecting the health rules and by going out and promoting anti-masking behavior right in downtown Winnipeg just 3 weeks ago, immediately followed by a big uptick in the number of cases 2 weeks later. I wonder if it's coincidental, or I wonder if the member did have any influence. The member likes to argue he has a lot of influence, Mr. Speaker, but now he's arguing he doesn't have any when he goes out and breaks all the health rules. And so I'm with the member. I'm with the member for St. John.
Order.
The member for St. John said, throw the book at him. She said, punish him. She said, put him in jail. She said, lock him up. And she wasn't just talking. She wasn't just talking about that organizer last Sunday at the Forks when she said it. That was another part of the internal dynamic of the NDP that we see over there every single day, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, anger.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a final supplementary question. Order. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a final supplementary question.
Well, we already knew that the Premier was out of touch with our teachers' needs. We knew that when he asked them to pay out of pocket for basic school supplies. And then when he was pressed on the matter, he doubled down and said, yeah, that's okay. And now he's proposing that he impose a program of highway medicine onto these teachers and force them to hit the road and drive to another country just to get a vaccine that we all know will help bring about the end of the pandemic. There are so many problems with his proposal, I don't know where to begin. But I guess one question we might rightly ask is, can teachers claim the cost of travel to North Dakota against the $1,500 tax credit the government announced? Shout out to Brian Gilchrist.
The Honourable First Minister.
A couple of things, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The member's kind of grabbing for issues, but we do think it's important to incent and to reward an inspired teaching community when they go out of pocket for extra projects, and many do. And so the federal government launched this initiative back 3 years ago. He's against it. He's on record saying he's against it. He's saying he's opposed to giving the teachers tax credit for money they spend out of pocket on inspiring their kids. So I'm glad he took the position. I think he's wrong. On the issue of teachers getting access, Prairie Mountain Health, Brandon downtown, we got 18 years of age and up. Teachers can get a vaccine. WRHA, Point Douglas North, downtown Winnipeg, Inkster, Point Douglas, Seven Oaks. Teachers 18 and up can get a vaccine. We're talking about in the Northern Health region, including Churchill. 18 and up, teachers can get a vaccine. AstraZeneca 40 plus at doctors, pharmacies, offices. The NDP leader, he can't be quiet. He has to keep talking because he never gets any substance into his questions, so he has to keep blabbing after to try to make up the gap. Well, Mr. Speaker, all I can say is we care about teachers. We want them to get vaccinated. That's what we'll be doing.
Order. Order. The honourable member for Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Exposure notices for COVID-19 in schools are growing by the day. Ecole Marie-Anne Gabory now has 24 cases between students and staff. Mitigation in all Manitoba schools should have been done, including vaccination and rapid testing on those without symptoms. Teachers have lost faith in this government's ability to mitigate the virus in their classrooms. And instead of prioritizing them close to home for vaccine, they got told today that they would have to take a day off and somehow travel to North Dakota in maybe a week or a month's time. This is shameful. Will the minister instead prioritize educators right here at home in Manitoba immediately?
The Honourable Minister for Education. I also want to remind, any more heckling here. The Honourable Minister for Education. I thought he was on the minister. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I do appreciate the member's question. Clearly, we're working very closely with educators across the province as it relates to the pandemic. We're working very closely in communications daily with our public health officials. I know Dr. Roosin indicated just earlier this week that the actual transmission in schools is very minimal. It appears the transmission is happening outside of schools. So for the most part, again, I thank our educators for keeping our schools a safe place to educate our students.
The honourable member for Transcona on a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to remind the minister that teachers aren't truck drivers and they don't drive to the border for a living. However, students and teachers are now facing a new threat with these variants. Teachers are fed up with this government's inaction and disregard for their needs. And instead of action, the Premier and his minister have cooked up a vaccination plan on the back of a napkin, one that is hours away on the highway. What if they don't have a car? Where are they supposed to find the time? That's not leadership, it's political desperation. Will the Premier prioritize vaccines for educators right here in Manitoba, everywhere, today?
The Honourable Minister for Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Obviously, we're working closely with our public health officials. We would like to have more vaccine available here in Manitoba. We're looking at options in terms of acquiring more vaccine, and we certainly want to make sure that our educators and our staff have that opportunity. Clearly, we're working with the Vaccine Implementation Task Force as well. I know they're doing good work with the vaccine they have. And again, our priority is about safety for Manitoba students and educators, and we're doing everything we can to make sure they stay safe.
Order. The honourable member for Transcona on a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Schools are already going remote because of exposures in the classroom, and they aren't in so-called hot zones. There are mounting cases. Like the rest of the province, cases and test positivity for young people are accelerating. Teachers and school staff are putting it all on the line for our students. It's time to prioritize them, all of them, for vaccination right here at home in Manitoba, not upwards of 4 hours away outside of Canada at some later date. This Premier and this Minister are simply out of touch. Will this government finally commit to vaccination for all teachers and school staff right here at home today?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, obviously we're monitoring this situation very closely. Public safety is certainly paramount for us. I do want to report that we do have, as over the last 2 weeks, 416 cases. That's both teachers and students, and that's across 230,000 teachers and students in our public school system. So actually the counts are quite low. We only have 4 out of the 250 schools are actually on remote learning. So I recognize there is growing concern. We are monitoring that concern, and again, public safety is number one.
The honourable member for Flin Flon.
Mr. Speaker, you know, for months now, the Pallister government has resisted the demands of workers for provincially mandated and paid sick leave. Federal government plan just doesn't cut it. This premier has waited and waited. So far, we've seen other premiers. Premier Ford has stepped up and said, you know what, we're going to implement paid sick leave. Horgan in BC said, we're going to implement paid sick leave. What happens back here at home, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Nothing. So when will this government do the right thing and implement much needed paid sick leave?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the Premier mentioned just earlier on in the question period, there's a call with the Prime Minister that he'll be raising with the Prime Minister. We know that there's lots of gaps within the existing program, and the Premiers are united, whether they're NDP, Liberal, or Conservative, to push the federal government to make sure the program, which they initially talked about, a $5 billion program, and yet announced their budget $1 billion, isn't good enough. And so that's why the Premier will be pushing later on this afternoon at the Prime Minister's call.
The honourable member for Flin Flon on a supplementary question.
You know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not a fan of Conservative governments, and I take exception to a lot of things that Liberal governments do. But, you know, when it's time to lead, that's what leaders should do, is lead. And at the end of the day, put aside whatever differences they have. So far, that's not what we've seen from our Premier. He whines, he complains, he blames everybody else, doesn't do anything. So other leaders, other premiers have seen that it's time to act and implement paid sick leave. Why won't this premier and this government do the same and implement paid sick leave today?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Premier of the province here isn't someone that just talks like the Leader of the Opposition. He actually gets things done. When you work with other premiers of other provinces in terms of things like the wage subsidy, we know what the federal government introduced in terms of the wage subsidy initially. It was going to be 10%. It obviously grew to 75% because of the work that the Premier of this province, as well as other premiers who united together. That process is happening again, and the Premier will be talking to the Prime Minister in the next hour about the gaps in the program that exist right now.
Order. The honourable member for Flin Flon on a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. 1,200 workers have gotten COVID on the job. At least that's the number that WCB accepted. No doubt there's a lot more. So we know that COVID's happening in the workplace. It's happening everywhere, right? Manitobans need to stay home when they're sick. They shouldn't have to make a choice of going to work when they're sick or feeding their families. That's just not right. So we need to make sure there's a paid sick leave program introduced now. So why won't this Premier step up just for once, do the right thing, protect Manitoba workers, and implement a paid sick leave program today?
The Honourable First Minister.
Well, instead of the talk that the member and his leader like to do, they could have a chance to walk on this one, because the premiers are all together on wanting the feds to reform this plan and make it work nationally. But what they have to fight, the member needs to listen for a second.
Order.
The member for Flin Flon should listen. He could understand. He could do something productive with his time. The reason the federal Liberals are going to be able to push this through.
Order.
If the federal Liberals push this through, it'll only be with the help of the NDP. It'll only be with the help of the NDP, because Jagmeet Singh's propping them up in there. So the only way they can get this ragtag proposal together, which doesn't work for workers, that the member and I agree is bad, is if we get the federal NDP to have an amendment. So why don't the NDP do something productive for once in their lives? Back the premiers of BC, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, the Yukon, Manitoba, back us up instead of trying to score cheap partisan political points. Do something for the workers of this country. Do something for a change. Get Singh to amend the bill.
Order. Order. I'm standing. The speaker's standing. Respect the chair, and let's have some decorum in this building here. The honourable member for St. John's.
Yikes, Deputy Premier, Deputy Speaker. Earlier this week, the Minister of Finance claimed hiding information was the best practice across Canada. BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the federal government all give the kind of information this minister has decided Manitobans aren't allowed to see. He's hiding essential information about the pandemic while misleading Manitobans about the reasons. He can't even get the research right. I tabled the research to prove that he is utterly wrong. Why is the Minister of Finance hiding information from the people of our province?
The Honourable First Minister.
Yeah, it's under point of privilege consideration. I don't think it's appropriate for the member to misrepresent the reality of the situation, though, in her preamble and use her time in that way. But she does regularly disrespect the rules of this House, and she's just done it again.
Order. The honourable member for St. John's on a supplementary question. Order.
To be fair, our questions have been vetted, and we understand that they are not in contravention of the matter of privilege. So,
Order.
There's nothing stopping the Minister of Finance from getting up today and giving Manitobans the essential information that belongs to them about the finances of the province. He claimed he doesn't want to because other provinces don't give the information. I just proved that's wrong. The minister can't even get his facts straight. It's sad when a minister intentionally misleads Manitobans during a pandemic. Will the minister stop playing games and give Manitobans the information that rightfully belongs to all of us?
The Honourable First Minister.
I should mention, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the best practices do not include trying to white out an email that accuses women trying to fundraise for a battered women's association of being do-good, ignorant white people. And that's what the member was involved in, Mr. Speaker. So we aren't going to do that. We've got more proactive disclosure here in this government than the NDP ever had. The member's wrong, puts false information on the record, but it is her habit to disrespect the rules of this place, and you're seeing it again right now.
Order. I just want to just tell all the members here to have some caution here where we're going, what direction we're going. So the honourable member for St. John's on a final supplementary question.
Good, Deputy Speaker. Well, let's talk about secrecy. It's the practice of this PC government, in particular this Premier and every single one of his cabinet, to hide information from Manitobans, whether it's the text of bills, making it harder to access FIPA, or a whole other means. Now we learn that the Minister of Finance is justifying wrong facts, why we cannot get the information that Manitobans rightly deserve. Will the Minister end his game and give Manitobans the information that rightfully belongs to all Manitobans on the spending or lack thereof of this government during the pandemic?
No, they're terrible.
Order. 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 The Honourable First Minister.
She's caught because she's sitting to her immediate left as someone who ran for public office while failing to disclose his own personal record. And so there is who she's led by. That is the leader she follows. This is the method that she subscribes to. Remember, who wrote a book and prescribed his recovery to the book as its reason for being writing, and then left out 7 of 8 criminal charges. You know, that's what we've got here. Here's a letter from John Williams. The province of Manitoba put out this press release because John Williams sent it to us. I am absolutely awestruck and dumbfounded to have this monumental honor bestowed upon me to be recognized in this way for my volunteer efforts on behalf of wildlife and their habitats. It's completely unexpected. It's one of the greatest distinctions a conservationist could receive. I'm extremely humbled and grateful. Well deserved, Mr. Williams. Thank you. Congratulations. And thank you very much for your years of service to the people of Manitoba.
The honourable member for Fort Garry.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. When you are a premier as unpopular as ours, it's understandable why you'd want to include self-promoting material along with a tax rebate. However, that doesn't make it right. And Bill 71 would seek to include materials supplied by the minister with the education property tax rebate, likely to include the government self-promoting political propaganda. That's just wrong. Bill 229 would prohibit the name, image, or title of a cabinet minister, including the premier, from being used on any material included with a check mailed by the government or any government agency. Will the minister leave partisan politics out of taxation and support Bill 229?
The Honourable First Minister.
I just want an update from the member on how he's doing with the arm wrestle with his leader and who's getting the bigger subsidy. I know they're both bigger than mine. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we're correcting years of mistakes by the NDP in not recognizing that two houses on the same street paying the same tax doesn't reflect the reality of what's inside in terms of earning power. And so we're raising education from income tax. Income tax is the way that we'll fund education in the future. The member opposite's heard of it. I'm not sure if he's paid it, but the member opposite's heard of it. And so he needs to understand that this is the fair and right way to do things while he lets from the other side. He needs to understand that the old way the NDP did it, forced seniors out of their homes, put pressure on people who were struggling, and was wrong, and we're going to correct that.
The honourable member for Fort Garry on a supplementary question.
You know, what the premier just doesn't understand is that none of us should be getting this rebate. And if there is going to be a rebate, it needs to go to the most vulnerable Manitobans, who especially renters, small business owners, and people with modest homes. So this just shows how out of touch this premier is. So why rebate checks? Well, he knows his popularity is plummeting, and he's attempting this last-ditch effort to buy popularity with a $1.3 million price tag for taxpayers, and Manitobans aren't convinced. One commentator said this: "Don't buy my vote with my own money. Fund education properly instead." Indeed. Now, I know this is a head scratcher for the premier, but on this side, we get it. Will this premier take the partisan politics out of the rebates and support Bill 229 today?
Again, I just want to remind everyone too that, you know what, it's very hard to hear the person, especially when on Zoom. So if everybody can have, like, at least one person's actually speaking on Zoom so that the answer can hear and everyone else can hear. The Honourable First Minister.
Let's just be clear, the member is out of touch, his party's out of touch, and they show it when they're against taking $40 million away from a top-heavy administration and giving it to the front line. And giving it to the front line where the students are. When they speak in favor of 400 junkets by trustees. When they speak in favor of a 40% tax increase in one of the most depressed areas of our province, which the member foisted on people then when he was a trustee. You know, these are the out-of-touch actions of an out-of-touch government with out-of-touch opposition with out-of-touch members. And I can say to the member opposite that we are going to make sure there's more resources on the front line for teachers, and that taxes to fund education are there and they're raised from income, a progressive way to do it, not from property tax. Right on.
The honourable member for Fort Garry on a final supplementary question.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, no school trustee ever wants to raise taxes. And the only reason they've done it in the last 5 years is year over year cuts by this premier and his cabinet to education. So it's completely inappropriate of this government to use publicly funded tax mailouts as an opportunity to promote themselves, their political agenda, or their party. It's a sign of this government's growing political desperation. Bill 229 calls this government's bluff, and they still refuse to support it. Without their unanimous support of this bill, it's more clear than ever that this government cares more about political games than they do about Manitobans. Will the Premier support Bill 229, yes or no?
Well,
The Honourable First Minister.
The member who's crying the crocodile tears about how hard it is to raise taxes was awfully good at it. He did it year after year after year after year. He got 40% increase in there in just 7 years. Now he tries to blame our government for his tendency to jack up taxes when we are funding education per capita basis better than every other province but one. So we're leading the country in funding education, healthcare, and social services, and we're reducing taxes because the taxes we put on Manitobans were oppressive, hurtful, and wrong, and we're going to remedy that by making sure there's more money on the kitchen tables of the families the NDP have been raiding for years, and that member was a big part of it even before he got involved provincially, so boy, is he in the right party now, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Boniface.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We have hundreds of cases of COVID in schools. When this government denies transmission is taking place in schools without backing it up with any evidence, it undermines what little credibility this government has left. I'll read an email we received from a teacher in a hot zone. Schools are being lectured by this government for shutting down when the case count becomes unmanageable because the government won't shut the schools down, and so the divisions made their own decisions to do so. They are now being lectured for doing this. I am watching colleagues within my own building come to work every day completely terrified for their own health and safety, end quote. Is this government going to stop putting politics ahead of public health and move all Winnipeg schools to remote learning, as the Manitoba Teachers Society and their own plan from September recommends?
The Honourable Minister for Education.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And you know, clearly we're taking advice from our public health officials. These are the experts when it comes to public health. I get the issue, I get the concern in the community. The reality is, Dr. Roussin said just this week, very little transmission within schools themselves. We've got protocols in place to keep both teachers and staff and students safe. We're taking advice every day from public health officials that are making recommendations to school boards as well. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I referenced earlier, really in terms of our 230,000 people involved in education, both teachers and staff, only 400 cases over the last 2 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our schools are remaining safe.
The honourable member for St. Boniface on a supplementary question.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this government has hundreds of thousands of rapid tests we could be using in schools, but they won't. They could be setting up vaccination clinics in school gyms and hotspots to vaccinate every person working in school. They won't, though there are over 100,000 vaccines available. Vaccines are critical, but they won't work instantly. They still take time to have a full effect. I quote the teacher again, please, from a teacher who is terrified to go to work every day, from a mother who wants to live to see her children grow up, from a human being who wants all of our children in schools to be safe, please have schools be temporarily shut down until we can get these case numbers under control again. Is this government going to keep forcing teachers, workers, and students into COVID hot zones without protection and without vaccinations, or will they break the chain of transmission with remote learning?
The Honourable Minister for Education.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, just reading the MTS magazine this morning, and they quote here, virtual classrooms should never be used as an alternative to in-class learning, as it is a poor substitute. Optimal student learning occurs when a teacher and a student are together. Virtual schools should only be an option when there is no alternative. That's the advice from MTS. We're also taking advice from public health officials. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our government takes public safety very seriously.
The honourable member for Tyndall Park on a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Teachers, school administrators, EAs, parents, students, all involved in our education system, including the Manitoba's Teachers Society, have repeatedly been calling for all people working in schools to be given priority access to COVID vaccines for weeks. Today, the Premier said teachers can go to North Dakota to get their vaccine. This is ridiculous. There are over 100,000 vaccines sitting in freezers here in Manitoba today that should be used. Why is the Premier encouraging travel instead of prioritizing those working in our school system with Manitoba's vaccine supply?
The Honourable First Minister.
Why does the federal Liberal government have us ranked between 40th and 50th on available vaccines? Why are we behind Guernsey? Why are we behind so many other countries, dozens of countries, on vaccine availability? That's why we've taken measures to protect ourselves here in Manitoba and in Canada to launch domestic production, because we want to make sure that the vaccines are available and that we're not put in this situation ever again, or in fact, possibly later this year or early next year, when we need boosters. And so I would encourage the member to speak up to those in Ottawa she is acquainted with, and I would also encourage her to encourage Ottawa to come up with a national sick leave program while she's at it.
The Honourable Member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Order.
Our government recently announced further funding from Budget 2021 to enhance criminal justice supports right here in Manitoba. Can the Minister of Justice please update the House on this very important initiative?
The Honourable Minister for Justice.
Thank the member for Brandon East for the question. Improving the criminal justice system is something our government takes seriously.
Order.
That's why we're providing $5.2 million through Budget 2021 to support key justice initiatives that will protect Manitobans, increase access to justice, and further modernize the provincial justice system. We are strengthening judicial resources by hiring 2 additional full-time judges. We are hiring 2 Crown attorneys to provide 24-hour service on call. And we're also providing Legal Aid Manitoba with an additional $2.3 million to provide private bar lawyers working with legal aid to ensure all Manitobans can access legal services regardless of their financial situation.
Order. The Honourable Member for Point Douglas.
Which, Deputy Speaker, Bill 56 has become a controversial piece of legislation with opposition even from the Canadian Cancer Society. That's because most people, other than members opposite, recognize how important, meaningful, and respectful consultation is when introducing legislation that will impact First Nation communities. This government has failed to consult First Nations leadership about Bill 56, and it will likely be challenged in court. Will the minister withdraw Bill 56 today? Yes or no?
Order. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health, Wellness and Recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As you know, cigarette smoking is one of the leading causes of preventable deaths in Manitoba, and this is a shocking statistic. Over 2,000 individuals die in this province annually as a result of smoking. We are going to continue to extend our reach to First Nation communities and leaders to engage with us on this very important piece of legislation, and we look forward to creating equity here in our province for non-smoking environments for our children and our young people.
Saving lives.
The Honourable Member for Point Douglas on a supplementary question.
Grand Chief Garrison Settee of MKO has written this minister, and I'll table the letter. Again, they implore this minister not to proceed at this time. They say it is astounding that this government would develop and table this legislation without first meaningfully engaging with First Nations. And they are all, and this is all the more troubling, that the text of the bill was withheld for months without being distributed, months in which they could and should have consulted. The approach of this government, he says, is misleading and undemocratic. Will the minister admit that this is the wrong approach and withdraw Bill 56?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health, Wellness and Recovery.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the spirit of reconciliation, we have reached out to all 3 Grand Chiefs, as well as all of the 63 First Nation communities, to have engagement and discussion and dialogue around this very important piece of legislation. And we continue to respect the local First Nation leaderships and communities' ability to make their own laws that align with their views on smoking. And I hope those views would align with the communities that have already established bylaws to restrict smoking on their reserves and work with our government to ensure equitable access to smoke-free environments in their communities. Thank you.
Time for oral questions has expired. Petitions. The Honourable Member for Union Station.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wish to present the following petition to the Legislative Assembly. To the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba, these are the reasons for this petition. 1 in 10 Manitobans will have a seizure in their lifetime, and the incidence of epilepsy in the Indigenous populations is double the national average. Epilepsy occurs just as often as breast and lung cancer worldwide. 2, COVID-19 has cancelled epilepsy surgeries booked for Manitoba patients elsewhere in Canada because they cannot receive this standardly routine surgery in the province. 3, Manitoba is the only province which has an inappropriate hospital environment to perform most epilepsy surgeries because it conducts epilepsy monitoring on orthopedics ward with orthopedic staff instead of an epilepsy ward with trained epilepsy staff. 4, patients in Manitoba have to wait 3 or more years for epilepsy surgery, which has resulted in them having to continue to suffer uncontrolled seizures, struggle with mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, headaches, general poor health, and even death in some cases. 5, since an epilepsy neurologist resigned in 2012, more neurologists have resigned due to dealing with old and failing equipment, which has resulted in sending patients out of province, costing the provincial government millions of dollars. 6, epilepsy surgery is extremely effective, resulting in patients requiring less medication, sometimes becoming seizure-free, enabling them to return to work, drive, and live fulfilling lives. We petition the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba as follows. 1, to urge the Minister of Health and Seniors Care to open a genuine 4-bed epilepsy unit similar to the one recently opened in Saskatchewan at the Health Sciences Centre with modern equipment and adequate epilepsy neurosurgeons, neurologists, nurses, clerks, and technicians. 2, to urge the Minister of Health and Seniors Care to formally establish an epilepsy program to ensure that all epilepsy staff can deliver care to patients in a coordinated fashion. This has been signed by many Manitobans.
In accordance with our rules 133-6, when petitions are read, they must be deemed to be received by the House. The Honourable Member for Keewatin-Nuuk.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I wish to present the following petition to the Legislative Assembly, of Manitoba. These are the reasons for this petition. Number 1, 1 in 10 Manitobans will have a seizure in their lifetime, and the incidence of epilepsy in the Indigenous populations is double the national average. Epilepsy occurs just as often as breast and lung cancer worldwide. 2, COVID-19 has cancelled epilepsy surgeries booked for Manitoba patients elsewhere in Canada because they cannot receive the standardly routine surgery in the province. 3, Manitoba is the only province which has an inappropriate hospital environment to perform most epilepsy surgeries because it conducts epilepsy monitoring on an orthopedics ward with orthopedic staff instead of an epilepsy ward with trained epilepsy staff. 4, patients in Manitoba have to wait 3 or more years for epilepsy surgery, which has resulted in them having to continue to suffer uncontrolled seizures, struggle with mental health issues, and including depression, anxiety, headaches, general poor health, and even death in some cases. 5, since an epilepsy neurologist resigned in 2012, More neurologists have resigned due to dealing with old and failing equipment, which has resulted in sending patients out of province, costing the provincial government millions of dollars. 6. Epilepsy surgery is extremely effective, resulting in patients requiring less medications, sometimes becoming seizure-free, enabling them to return to work, drive, and live fulfilling lives. We petition the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba as follows. 1. To urge the Minister of Health and Seniors Care to open a genuine 4-bed epilepsy unit similar to the one recently opened in Saskatchewan at the Health Science Centre with modern equipment and adequate epilepsy neurosurgeons, neurologists, nurses, clerks, and technicians. 2. To urge the Minister of Health and Seniors Care to formally establish an epilepsy program to ensure that all epilepsy staff can deliver care to patients in a coordinated fashion. This has been signed by many Manitobans.
The honourable member for River Heights.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wish to present the following petition to the Legislative Assembly. The background to this petition is as follows. The Vivian Sands project is a proposed silica sand mine and processing plant to be built in the RM of Springfield. The overall project includes mining claims of over 85,000 hectares, making it the largest claim ever given to a single company in Manitoba's history. It is larger than the city of Winnipeg, which is 46,410 hectares. The amount of dry, solid sand mined produced per year, according to the EAP, is 1.36 million tons, and much of this sand will be used in fracking. A major concern of the proposed mine and plant is that if developed, it could contaminate the Sandilands aquifer, including both carbonate and sandstone aquifers, which covers much of southeastern Manitoba. It has excellent water quality and is the water source for tens of thousands of Manitobans, including many municipal water systems, agriculture, industry, private wells, and an abundance of wildlife and ecosystems. Further, people in the Indigenous communities that are potentially affected by this were not afforded the required Indigenous consultation from either federal or provincial government officials. The sustainable yield of the combined sandstone and carbonate aquifers has still not yet been established by provincial authorities. The mine could cause leaching of acid and heavy metals and pollute the aquifer as it will go down 200 feet into the Winnipeg formation of the sandstone aquifer. There is concern that the shale, which separates the carbonate and sandstone aquifers, sand and pyritic oolite itself contains sulfides, will, when exposed to injected air from the Can White Sands extraction process, turn to acid. An additional concern with the proposed mine and plant is the potential to pollute the Broken Head River and the aquatic food chain leading to Lake Winnipeg. Residents in the area have also expressed fears of being overexposed to silica dust during production, as there has been a demonstrated lack of safety and environmental procedures by the Can White Sands Corporation during the exploratory drilling phase. Signage and fencing has been poor. Identifying and required mine claim tags were missing. There were no warnings for silica dust exposure and no coverings to prevent exposure of the silica stockpiles to the elements. Residents' concerns include the fact that boreholes, which should have been promptly and properly sealed, were left open for a year. The drilling of hundreds of improperly sealed boreholes yearly creates significant risks of surface contamination, mixing of aquifer waters, and drainage of surface fecal matters into the aquifer. There is also a risk of subsidence around each borehole as a result of sand extraction. There are also potential transboundary issues that need to be addressed as the aquifers extend into Minnesota. This project should not proceed, as no licensing conditions and mitigation measures will alleviate the risk to all Manitobans and the environment, since Can White Sands Corporation plans to use an unprecedented mining technique with no established safe outcome. The corporation has gone on record indicating that it does not know how to mine for the silica in the water supply and need to develop a new extraction methodology that's never been done before. Contamination of the aquifers and the environment is irreversible, and there are many surface sources of high purity silica that can be extracted without endangering two essential regional aquifers. We petition the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba as follows: to urge the provincial government to undertake a combined review of the Vivian Sand Facility processing plant and the mining extraction portion of the operation as a Class 3 development, with a review by Manitoba's Clean Environment Commission to include public hearings and participant funding. To urge the provincial government to halt all activity at the mine and plant until the Clean Environment Commission's review is completed and the project proposal has been thoroughly evaluated. Signed by James Brink, Susan Tillman, Michael Canellis, and many, many other Manitobans. Thank you.
The honour member for Elmwood.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I wish to present the following petition to the Legislative Assembly. The background of this petition is as follows. Number one, 2,755 homes in the Elmwood East Kildonan area have lead water pipes connecting their basements to the city-owned water pipes at their property line. Homes built before 1950 are likely to have lead water pipes running to this connection. Number two, new lead levels guidelines issued by Health Canada in 2019 are a response to findings that lead concentrations in drinking water should be kept as low as reasonably achievable, as lead exposures are inherently unsafe and have serious health consequences, especially for children and expectant mothers. Number three, 31% of Winnipeg's 23,000 homes with lead water pipes connecting basements to the city-owned water pipes at their property line were found to have lead levels above the new Health Canada lead level guidelines. Number four, the City of Winnipeg has an inventory of which homes and public buildings, including schools and daycares, that have the lead water pipe connection to the city's water main, and will only disclose this information to the homeowner or property owner. The cost of replacing the lead water pipe to individual homeowners is over $4,000. We petition the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba as follows: to urge the provincial government to immediately contact all home and property owners in Manitoba with lead water pipes connecting to the city water main line and provide full financial support to them for lead water pipe replacement so that their exposure to lead levels is reduced, their health is better, and costs to our provincial healthcare system are also reduced. And this petition is signed by many, many Manitobans.
Any further petitions? Any grievances? Orders of the day, government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could you please call for debate bill number 71 for second reading?
Well, we're going to have to call and debate for second reading of Bill number 71, the Education Property Tax Reduction Act, Property Tax and Installation Assistance Act, and the Income Tax Amended Act. And it's in the honourable name of the member for Flin Flon. He has 29 minutes remaining. The honourable member for Flin Flon.
Just 29 minutes remaining. So, you know, we talked a little bit about the reasoned amendment previously, and really the government should have passed that because it was quite a reasonable amendment. So now we're back to debating the actual substance of the bill, or the lack of substance in the bill. It's easy for this government to say, well, we're just going to do away with the education property tax, and everybody's going to say, yay, I pay less taxes. But what the government hasn't said, even though we've repeatedly brought it to their attention, is what they will replace that lost revenue with. So we're left to be concerned that they won't replace that lost revenue. Because what we've seen from this bunch when it came to healthcare was cut, 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 cut. What we've seen with infrastructure from this bunch is cut, 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 cut. We've already seen this bunch crank up the cost for post-secondary education. Students having to pay more to get to university, which bears a disproportionate impact on young folks from the north again, because they have to pay more for that education, but they also have to pay more for lodging, food, transportation, which this government doesn't take into account, nor do they care. Because what we've seen with everything from this government is they really don't care about the north or people in the north. Healthcare certainly has been devastated by this Pallister government and the Deputy Premier, who was the first health minister under this government to attack Northern healthcare. So you're wondering, Mr. Deputy Speaker, no doubt, what does this have to do with Bill 71? Well, it bears a striking resemblance, what they're planning with education, with what they did to healthcare. We know that healthcare has been devastated. We know that they've cranked up prices for post-secondary for folks. So what's the plan for education in the province? We've seen their Bill 64. We see that it takes complete control away from local boards, local communities, local people. So I'm sure in their minds, this is all about saving money. It's not about providing proper, better education for people. When you look at the new proposed northern school division, it's 3/4 of the province. It runs from border to border to border. It's impossible for a school division, one single school division, to properly recognize the distinct requirements of all those communities within that school division. Which is why when you look at how the Frontier School Division is structured today, there's, 5 different divisions within that division, because they realize that just having one voice, potentially in Winnipeg, or any one community for that matter, wasn't going to properly represent all of those communities, all of those distinct areas. So now we see with this bill that they propose doing away with the property tax, the education portion of the property tax, that there's going to be a huge sum of money disappear from the provincial coffers. And disproportionately, that huge sum of money is going to be rewarded to the folks that need help the least. The people down on Wellington Crescent in their $1 million homes. It's not going to help the folks in Lynn Lake, for example, that might have a $20,000 home. they're going to get a small portion rebate. And they're going to lose their local voice in their school. All in the interest of this Premier and his caucus saving money. Nothing more. So we know that out-of-province landlords, who knew? We're going to shovel a bunch of tax dollars back to help them. Well, how's that going to help Manitoba kids have a better education? Well, it's not. It's all about this Pallister government looking out for their friends. We know that agricultural corporations are going to get a huge payback. And the concept of doing away with the education portion of tax isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. It should be done over a period of time, but the most important thing is there should be part of that whole plan is how will education be properly funded going forward? We know that the costs are generally going to go up, not down, unless you start doing away with something within the education system, shutting down schools, laying off teachers, getting rid of EAs, jamming more kids into a classroom. All the things that are going to make it worse for the public education system. Now, I suppose some of the folks that are reaping the biggest benefit from this tax cut will put their kids in private school because they'll have more money to do that now, won't they? So they won't notice the cuts. They'll get the biggest reward from the tax cut and notice the degradation of education the least. So really that's the whole basis of our concern with this particular bill is it rushes to do something that should be done more gradually, and it completely, utterly fails to mention or say anything about how education will be funded going forward. Where is that money coming from? Now, one of them stood up here today, I forget, might have been the Premier, might have been the Deputy Premier, who knows, said, well, it'll be funded from general revenue. But general revenue isn't going to have that tax dollar that's being given back to folks because this Premier is going to send a check out with his name on it. Well, maybe not. Maybe common sense will prevail across the way and they'll agree to pass our bill that prohibits the Premier from putting his name and the Finance Minister from putting his stamp on a letter that goes out with these pork barrel checks. Because that's all it is, right? Pork barrel politics at its finest. They know they're losing in the polls, so the crassest way to try and convince people is to throw money at them. And that's all this bill is. It's taking money away from education and trying to get the PC government reelected. Most Manitobans, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, are smarter than that. But there's so many Manitobans struggling throughout this pandemic, and particularly because of the actions or lack of actions on the part of this government, that they'll be happy to accept whatever meager dollars they can get to try and stave off hunger losing your house, and all the rest of these things that are happening to real people during this pandemic. What a horrible time to have the biggest tax giveaway in Manitoba history, when really we should be figuring out how to stimulate an economy. And the best way to do that has been proven time and time again, is through public spending to get the gears greased, to get things moving. But that's not what this bunch is going to do, right? They're going to just make life less affordable for average Manitobans while looking after their pals, to the detriment of everybody else in Manitoba. You know, they had the opportunity yet again to do something good for Manitoba. They could have introduced legislation that showed a path to how they were going to reduce, in realistic terms, the education property tax. But along with that, they could have realistically introduced legislation that showed how they were going to have the necessary funds available to properly fund public education, to make sure that our kids, our grandkids, had access to teachers, educational assistants, resources, schools, proper class sizes, to make sure that our teachers had the resources to do their jobs properly, so that they didn't have to take money from their wages that have been frozen for multiple years by this government to try and provide the resources that kids needed in those schools. But this government is fine with people paying out of their own pocket, as long as it doesn't come out of the government's pocket. Well, unless it's coming out of the government's pocket to help their wealthy friends, then they're okay with that. You know, we've starting to see a new government, a new perspective down in the States that recognizes the importance of stimulus packages to get an economy going after a recession like we've seen with COVID. But this government is still stuck in Reagan-era mentality, where cuts were all that mattered. Whether it was Reagan or Thatcher in England, they decimated their countries, decimated things like education, healthcare, transportation, all of those things that governments need to be so actively involved in. And yet, this government is stuck in a time warp of some sort, that they haven't recognized that that kind of economic thinking has come and gone and proved to be completely wrong, proved to be completely devastating to an economy. So I'll end by simply saying that really and truly, this government should stop. Put the brakes on. Come up with a real plan that talks about how they're going to reduce the property tax, how they're going to replace those funds in general revenue, how they're going to properly fund education, how they're going to properly fund healthcare, how they're going to properly fund all the services that a government should be properly funding. Instead, they're going to decimate services, like we've seen already with healthcare, with infrastructure, and with everything else, education is next on the chopping block. So, Acting Deputy Speaker, I'll end my remarks there because I'm sure others want to express their ideas about how this government could have, should have done things, but didn't. Thank you.
The member for St. Vital.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about Bill 71. And I do want to reiterate some of the points that we heard from the member from Flin Flon. This is a big question about the future of our province. We know changing our education system will impact generations of kids to come. And, at great length, we've spoken about the inequities in Bill 71 and the fact that wealthy Manitobans will benefit more from this bill than middle income or lower income individuals, that renters won't see a benefit and in some cases will even pay more than the wealthiest Manitobans. And we know that's not fair. That's been spoken to at length. What the member from Flin Flon mentioned that I will also want to talk about is just the mere fact that this tax cut is being proposed, and the fact that there is no proper explanation about how our provincial services are going to be affected. This year alone, this cut 25% off of the school property tax is roughly $200 million or so. Where is that money going to come from to be replaced in our education system? Honestly, the minister hasn't just clearly defined and described that. The premier hasn't done that either. No member of cabinet has clearly described where they're going to make up that 200 or some odd $million that are going to be refunded, a lot of which is going to go to the wealthiest Manitobans. Now, we're left to wonder and speculate where that money is going to come from. Is that money going to come straight out of our education system? And we're going to see massive cuts to the services that teachers can provide. Perhaps even layoffs of teachers, closings of schools. We don't know. Because when you're taking $200 or so million out of our education system, how are our teachers and classrooms going to make up for that? How is our system going to remain sustainable when we're removing such a large chunk of funding, such a large portion of the dollars that they need to teach our children and set them up for success in their future? Or the other possibility is that the government is going to take that money, a portion of that money, from other critical services that we rely on in Manitoba. Services such as our healthcare system. Is it going to mean that this tax cut that goes to the wealthiest Manitobans is going to mean we have less services in our healthcare system and less nurses to help people through the ending days of our pandemic, hopefully the ending days of our pandemic? Does it mean that we'll have longer wait times in our emergency rooms, or longer wait times for surgeries? Because we know how tight and stretched our healthcare system is now, and only imagine what will happen once there's a huge cut as a result of Bill 71. Or perhaps it's not going to be healthcare. Perhaps it's going to be child and family services. Perhaps it's going to be housing. And we'll see another crisis occur in our province where people will be desperately in look for services, desperately in need of housing services or social programs or family programs that will no longer be funded by this province because they chose to prioritize the wealthiest in our community over the people who needed the help the most. So is that the decision that our government is making? Because they clearly haven't articulated their plan. They haven't said how they're going to make up the money. And it is leaving all of us in Manitoba to wonder, to truly wonder, what the downstream impacts of Bill 71 will be. Or perhaps, as I believe the Premier alluded to today in question period, that the remaining funding will come from general revenue and perhaps the income tax. It will come from income tax. So does that mean the Premier is looking at increasing or changing our provincial income tax system in our province? And if so, if that's his plan, well then please tell Manitobans what that plan is and what that change to our income tax system will look like. Will it be done in such a way that is equitable for Manitobans, where the wealthiest Manitobans pay a larger proportion and then low-income individuals in our province can pay their fair share? Or will it be done the same way, with the same approach that they're taking on Bill 71, where it's a blanket number across the board, which we know would impact the poorest Manitobans the most? That seems to be the approach that they've done a lot of their policies with recently. We see that blanket approach, regardless of need or ability to pay, taken in Bill 71. We've seen that with other business programs, a blanket amounts across the board, regardless of need or industry. We've seen that blanket approach taken in many other areas, and that's such a cop-out in terms of policy development, saying that a one size fits all approach. You know, that's not the way that our unique and specific issues in our province should be dealt with. The nuance that people are facing, the nuanced issues that people are facing, deserve and require a nuanced solution. And so for this government to put forward this plan that shows no consideration for the variety of issues and the complexity of not only our taxation system, the income divide in our province, or quite frankly, the education system, or the variety of services our province deliver to people who need them, is shocking and disappointing. You know, it is shocking because in this day and age, many people feel that we should have and ought to have a government that knows Manitobans' priorities better. But sadly, it's not surprising because year after year with this Palliser government, we've seen this track record play out. It's a broken record at this point, and Manitobans have had quite enough of it. And so I'll just conclude my brief remarks by saying to all members who are listening that your constituents deserve better than this Bill 71. And so I urge you, in the remaining days, in the remaining time we have left to debate this, to actually be a voice for those constituents. Maybe take up some time and debate today and truly express their feelings on Bill 71 and the impacts that it would have on their lives. Talk about the feelings of the renters in your community and how this bill will impact them, because it's not going to be good for the renters in your neighborhood, and each and every member in this chamber has renters in their constituency. So talk about their feelings. And once you do that, I think you'll have a strong realization about the many, many negative impacts of Bill 71. And at that point, I urge you to vote against it. Thank you very much, Mr. Assistant Deputy Speaker.
The member for Notre Dame.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant Deputy Speaker. Earlier this morning, I understand because it's maybe the last day before break week, it just seems to be very raucous inside the chamber today, and this morning even. I think one of the PCMLAs said that, you know, the wrangling that's going on is tantamount to class warfare. I don't think we need to be this dramatic. I think we're already living in a pandemic, which is dramatic enough for everybody, and I think we can all agree on that, and that we can maybe just try to do our best here in the chamber and be leaders. And so if we're debating Bill 71, you know, it's not about class warfare. I think what we're just trying to hammer out here is what is really the best type of taxation system for our province at this point in history. I just wanted to begin my remarks by kind of leaving off where I was at last time when I was talking about the amendment. Ensuring that the tax system can raise the appropriate amount of revenues in a fair and equitable manner is thus of central importance to the functioning of a modern state. And especially in times like this, when there's a public health crisis and an economic crisis, when governments need to step up and serve people. And flat taxation rates and rebates, like what this government is proposing through Bill 71, is as opposed to progressive taxation rates and rebates. You know, this is a problem because it causes more income inequality among Manitobans. And earlier this morning, we heard PCMLAs in the debate about the Premier's signature on checks. You know, they were saying, well, there's nothing wrong with a flat tax rebate, but there is something wrong with it because it causes more income inequality among Manitobans. Progressive tax rates and rebates would result in a more just distribution of income and direct improvement in the life of low-income households. And a good tax system, including tax rates and tax rebates, must be progressive for reasons of fairness and justice, but also on economic grounds, because when you're raising the same percentage off income and tax, that should require less sacrifice from those who are already able to provide for a comfortable life than from those who are struggling to make ends meet. And again, in economics, this is called the marginal utility of money, and it declines as income rises. That is, the perceived and actual benefit derived from an extra dollar of income is much higher for someone panhandling on the street than for someone driving past in an AMG. Progressive taxation opportunities and improve social mobility. In a hypothetical world where market income is distributed equally, there would be no need for progressive taxation. Government revenues could be raised optimally with a single tax rate, also known as a flat tax, like what the PCs are proposing in Bill 71. This is a flat taxation system. But in the presence of significant income inequality, like what we have here in our province, progressive taxation ensures that necessary revenues are collected with a smaller shared sacrifice than a flat tax system would impose. Progressive taxation, not flat taxation, reduces the incomes of the richest, generates revenues that can be used to reduce inequality through public expenditures on the provision of public services and infrastructure that have greater relative benefit to low-income households. And even if the rich had a moral claim to their high incomes, there are good reasons why redistribution benefits society as a whole. We know that income inequality is rising. The average income of the top 10% of Canadians was 10 times higher than that of the bottom 10%, and the richest 1% of Canadians received almost 1/3 of all income growth in the past 2 decades. Incomes at the top have more than doubled over the last 30 years. What is also particularly relevant for tax design is the sharp growth in inequality. It's been driven largely by changes in the labor market, specifically the widening gap between wages of part-time and temporary and contract workers at the bottom, and soaring compensation packages for business executives at the top. In his book, Capital in the 21st Century, economist Thomas Piketty made the connection between inequality and tax policy explicit. He said, the resurgence of inequality after 1980 is due largely to the political shifts of the past several decades, especially in regard to taxation and finance, end quote. In Manitoba, since then, those shifts took two main forms. The first was a shift of the tax bill from business to families through large reductions of corporate income taxes and a proliferation of business subsidies and tax credits. The second was a shift of the tax bill from higher income to middle and modest income families. And the most comprehensive study of tax incidence in Canada by Mark Lee finds that the tax system was progressive only up to the middle of the income distribution. Then it flattens out and actually becomes regressive at the very top. So as a result, Canada's top 1% faced overall tax rates lower than those of households in the bottom 10%. And the highest tax rates are found in the middle to upper middle of the income distribution. Tax rates at the bottom incomes have actually increased due to a number of small changes in regressive taxes, including consumption, payroll, and property taxes, and other provincial taxes and fees. And the peak tax rates are faced by households in the middle of the income distribution, and they pay about 6 percentage points more of their income tax than both those at the top and at the bottom. And this pattern violates the taxation principle of vertical equity. And I mentioned before that we haven't had a major tax reform commission since 1966. So obviously it's time to do that again and make sure that we can try to reform our taxes to make them more fair. Personal income tax remains relatively progressive, with income brackets that apply higher tax rates as individuals earn higher amounts of income. But that's only one of the several taxes that people pay. Other taxes are regressive, which is to say that lower income families pay a higher effective tax rate than those with higher incomes. And again, Bill 71 is one of those regressive types of taxes because the penalties are going to be paid for by those at the lower end of the spectrum of income. A key step towards more progressive taxes would be to ensure that wealthier individuals contribute their fair share to the public. With this flat tax rebate, the PCs are doing the opposite. The wealthy get the breaks and the lowest incomes get all the clawbacks or get the smallest gains. I mentioned last week about the couple in Gimli, a senior citizen couple that I met. They are very good at finance, and they were able to calculate that their education rebate would be $30. It is very wrong, unfair, and punitive what this PC government is doing with Bill 71 and clawing back that tax credit that renters receive for their rent payments. You know, this morning, during the debate regarding the moral validity of the Premier spending $1.3 million on postage on checks being sent out with his name on it and promotional partisan material on it, we heard the PC MLAs reference provisions in Bill 71, and they argued that there's nothing wrong with a flat tax rebate dishing out unequal outcomes. And the PCMLA said that those who have paid the most for education taxes should get the most rebates. They said that those who have paid little for education taxes should get little amounts in rebates. What's wrong with that? They said, and they went further and said, and those who are renters, since they do not explicit education taxes, should get their rental rebates removed. I'd like to point out that that piece that was said this morning about rental clawbacks is completely false. First of all, renters usually incur increased costs of their landlords in the form of higher rent payments. I've never heard the opposite to be true, that landlords would pass on any savings to renters in the form of lower rent payments. And secondly, Bill 71 will be removing the rebates that renters depend on. It's usually about $700 for most renters. And that is not providing, quote unquote, kitchen table tax relief for renters. And some of these renters have been the most hard hit by COVID, the recession. and infection. Third, even though this government is nominally saying that there will be a rent freeze for 3 years, it doesn't mean that this is what is happening in practice. In fact, the opposite. Through Freedom of Information requests, the public now knows that in 2020, the government's Residential Tenancy Board approved 100% of all landlord applications for above rental rate guidelines, specifically that the Freedom of Information request yielded that in the 2019-2020 fiscal year, the Residential Tenancies Board approved 310 applications of above rate guidelines out of the 310 applications that were submitted. Those 310 applications referred to 20,400 rental units. And out of those 20,400 rental units, 2,700 of those units, and people paying for this, saw more than 20% increases in those increased rates. So this is why we just can't roll with it and believe, when the PC say that they will nominally freeze rental rates for some time, because there are loopholes and back doors that lead to 100% rental increases for tens of thousands of renters. But let's get back to, again, what the PC said this morning about there being nothing wrong with wealthier people or people who pay more in education taxes getting higher rebates than obviously poorer people or people who pay less in education taxes getting smaller amounts or even rebate clawbacks. As in the case of renters, the PCs have heard earlier arguments about regressive, versus progressive taxation, but it still doesn't move them. Bill 71's flat rebate, which is a regressive tax instead of a progressive tax rebate, will contribute to more inequality in Manitoba. And why should we be concerned about more inequality in Manitoba when the gains from economic growth are concentrated at the top, as they have been, for the last few decades? Most Manitobans will have the diminished capacity to purchase the output of goods services. The result is that new investment and economic growth stagnate, and this in turn means that unemployment and underemployment remain at very high levels. Another consequence of stagnation is that growth in government revenues is also stalled, and it becomes more and more difficult to maintain existing programs, let alone introducing much needed new programs like universal childcare or a comprehensive system to address mental health and addictions like what the Virgo report recommended. These conditions create a situation where it becomes difficult to sustain the important physical and social infrastructure of society, and this leads to instability. Even the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, recognizes that, quote, history shows a clear association between inequality and instability, end quote. And in light of this danger of growing instability, it makes great sense for governments to pursue measures to reduce income inequality. A second aspect to the case for reducing income inequality is that the current structure of income is determined by government policies that favor the wealthy at the expense of working poor and the poor. One of the best things about living in Manitoba is the chance that someone born in poverty in this province will have the opportunity to make something of herself if she and her mother have access to decent housing, if they're able to live in a safe community, if they have access to early childhood education and nutrition programs, a chance at gaining excellent public education, a chance to get post-secondary training, a chance at a healthy life and ability to access health resources. All these valuable public services are provided by community when we share our resources through taxation and redistribution. And with these opportunities, this young child, this young girl can grow into an adult with decent work opportunities and the ability to support herself and her family and pay taxes back to the community. Taxes are what we pay for in a civilized society. Taxes are what we pay to ensure equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. The taxes we pay contribute substantially to our standard of living by providing us with some of the best public services in the world. Canadian economists such as Hugh Mackenzie and Richard Shillington have measured the quote-unquote fiscal bargain, or the balance between taxes and public services, benefited by household income. And the authors found that for 2/3 of Canadians, their benefit from public services adds up to more than 50% of their household's total earned income. Looking at Manitobans' median income households, our benefit from public services amount to $41,000 every year. And Hugh Mackenzie and Richard Shillington's study shows how powerful a role public spending plays in ensuring that the majority of Manitobans enjoy a better quality of life. In closing, in general, there is a need for tax reform to ensure that our communities are supported by a fair, equitable tax system. The PCs have failed to ensure this with their tax rebate. It's a flat tax rebate, and it's not fair to all Manitobans. The wealthiest Manitobans will make significant gains. Those with the lowest incomes and middle incomes will either see their existing rebates clawed back or will receive small amounts. Those who have been hardest hit by the pandemic will not see gains from this regressive tax rebate. This flat tax rebate will create more income inequality in Manitoba, and that is not good for a number of reasons. For these reasons, on this side of the House, we cannot support this set of tax reform because this bill fails to ensure an equitable distribution across income groups, and it makes life less affordable for renters in Manitoba. Bill 71 as it stands will put money on the tables of the wealthiest Manitobans, and the rest of us will get the crumbs that fall on the floor under the Premier's kitchen table, and some of us, specifically those at rent, will even get those crumbs swept away. Thank you, Mr. Assistant Deputy Speaker.
The member for DePaul-Camisac.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker. Once again, it's an absolute honor to put some words on record as the MLA for the DePaul-Camisac. I'm here to speak and support the amendments on my side of the House with the opposition NDP. I want to clearly say that the only thing that I do understand about this bill is that I do not understand this government's intentions and damage to this province's education system. And Bill 71 is a sure direct approach in doing so. So this tax cut is a bad idea. As a parent, I'm quite worried about where this shortfall in revenue is going to come from in regarding to our children's education, my children's education. To me, Mr. Deputy Acting Speaker, in wolf's clothing. This is not going to help us. You may think this is going to help us, but this tax cut will just absolutely diminish our children's education when we are struggling in a diminished education system in this province. And now, during a global pandemic, right? A global pandemic.
Could I ask the member from DePaul-Camisac to repeat that, because we were not able to get the last couple sentences?
A court. Okay. How is this loss of revenue going to support our children with additional needs? How is this loss of support, going to hire more EAs that is truly needed in our schools? How is this loss of revenue going to hire more teachers? How is this loss of support and revenue going to help with child poverty and mental health? For example, Mary Duncan School is a school in my constituency in the Paw that has a special place in my heart. How is this school going to survive? This is a school that welcomes students where other schools in our region may have given up on them. So Mary Duncan School is a place where these students can gather, get an education in a culturally safe place. This school, I cannot imagine how it's going to continue running after this revenue is taken away from this school that is truly needed in every single community in our province. I also want to say that, you know, Bill 71 has serious implications for education funding in our province. Isn't the first.
Could you repeat the last couple sentences, because we are not able to hear you?
Manipulated public finances and laws about this government playing with public finances. Can you hear that? This isn't the first time the Pallister government has manipulated.
The member for DePaul Kamisak, your video is not showing us, and the audio is. The member from DePaul
For
Kamisak.
their political benefit. For example, can you hear me now, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker?
Yes.
Okay, let me round this up once again, about how this government is playing with public finances. Let me repeat again, it's misleading Manitobans about public finances to mask the true scale of the cuts they're making to our public services, such as our schools. Manitobans want to trust that the government is being transparent and responsible with taxpayer dollars, but that simply isn't happening under the Pallister government. Again, I just want to touch back about public services with their education. Once again, I have to put on record that this government has no respect for teachers and our students. And this has been clearly demonstrated the past couple of weeks with these, you know, mindless bills, 64 and 71. Even the Premier's comments were quite troubling as a parent, as, you know, talking about reimbursing our teachers $150 after telling them to own up and to our children. And North Dakota, holy smokes, that was very insulting to tell our teachers to gather, travel, perhaps violating travel restrictions, when instead of making it easier and responding to the school division's letters asking to be vaccinated, those are being ignored. Now he's telling them to go to North Dakota. And with that, his bill hinges future funding for education on economic growth, which is completely irresponsible in these unpredictable times, a global pandemic. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, Bill 71 is the final insult. Egose.
The member for Concordia.
Well, thank you very much. No. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to put a few words on the record and maybe today even be able to hear myself think and speak. In contrast to yesterday, when I guess the words that I was putting on the record got the members here in the chamber on the government side a little riled up, and I'm not surprised, because if I had to go to my constituents, explain to them how for many of them this supposed tax decrease is actually an increase for them, how they're paying more at the end of the day on their education property tax, I think I'd be a little bit worked up too. If I had to go tell them at the same time that if you are getting a benefit, it's probably not that substantial, and that we're also giving the Premier his check of $4,000 on top of his second property and his third property and on down the line. I don't know how pieces of property the Premier has. You know, the member for Flin Flon makes a good point. You know, it's not members on this side of the House that are agreeing to give the Premier his check. It's the Premier, and it's his entire cabinet who are walking in lockstep with him to make sure that his signature gets signed on the bottom of that check, that he gets that money, he gets his $4,000 rebate, while the rest of Manitoba pay less. I also want to acknowledge my colleague from the Pas-de-Calais, who rightly put the focus on the educational outcomes of our kids, and how after 5 years of cuts from this government, and we're seeing test scores have gone down year after year after year. They're getting worse under this government's watch. Now their proposal is, well, we're just going to cut a whole bunch of money from the education budget on top of what we were already cutting. And hope and pray and wish that this deficit financing situation that they've painted themselves into will just somehow continue, that the Liberal government in Ottawa will continue on, and that Justin Trudeau can continue to keep this government afloat and keep paying for this government's massive cuts to our education system, our healthcare system, and so on down the line. Well, Manitobans see through that. Every member here next week has a chance during constituency week to, well, I wouldn't say go knock on doors, because I don't think we're supposed to be doing that right now. But what you can do is you can pick up the phone and maybe call some parents, maybe call some teachers, call some educators in your constituency, and see what they think about this plan. And if they were to do that, I got my doubts, I got to be honest, but I got my doubts that they would. But if they did do that, they would hear absolutely clearly that what people are asking for is good investments in our education system, a strong education system here in the province, and fairness when it comes to taxation. Not giving the rich, not giving our Premier a $4,000 check, but ensuring that every Manitoban pays their fair share and gets a break where they need it. I'll end my comments there, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think it's clear this side of the House we will be voting against Bill 71.
Are there any other members who wish to speak to this bill? Is the House ready for the question? The question before the House is second reading of Bill number 71, the Education Property Tax Reduction Act, Property Tax and Insulation Assistance Act, and Income Tax amended. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt this motion?
No. Agreed.
I hear a no. All those in favor of the motion, please say yay.
Yay.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
In my opinion, the yeas have it. The official opposition House Leader?
A recorded vote, Deputy Speaker.
A recorded vote has been requested. Call in the members.
The 1 hour provided for ringing of the division bells has expired. I am therefore directing the division bells to be turned off and the House proceed with the vote. The question before the House is second reading of Bill number 2071, Education Property Tax Reduction Act. All those in the chamber in favor of the motion, please rise.
Okay.
Honourable Mr. Gertson.
Nope. Honourable Mr. Pallister first.
Sorry. Honourable Mr. Pallister.
Honourable Mr. Pallister.
Honourable Mr. Gertson.
Honourable Mr. Gertson.
Honourable Mr. Wharton.
Honourable Mr. Wharton.
Honourable Mr. Fielding.
Honourable Mr. Fielding.
Honourable Mr. Schuler.
Honourable Mr. Schuler.
Honourable Mr. Cullen.
Honourable Mr. Cullen.
Honourable Mr. Johnson, Interlake Gimli.
Honourable Mr. Johnson, Interlake Gimli.
Honourable Ms. Squires.
Honourable Ms. Squires.
Honourable Ms. Gordon.
Honourable Ms. Gordon.
Mr. Micklefield.
Mr. Micklefield.
All those in the chamber opposed to the motion, please rise.
Mr. Canoe.
Mr. Canoe.
Ms. Fontaine.
Ms. Fontaine.
Mr. Weeb.
Mr. Weeb.
Mr. Lindsay.
Mr. Lindsay.
MLA Assaguara.
MLA Assaguara.
We'll now proceed with the members participating virtually in alphabetical order, with each member clearly identifying I vote yes or I vote no. Would the page please conduct the vote?
Ms. Adams.
I vote no.
Ms. Adams votes no.
Mr. Altamere.
I vote no.
Mr. Altamere votes no.
Mr. Brar.
I vote no.
Mr. Brar votes no.
Mr. Bushy.
I vote no.
Mr. Bushy votes no.
Honourable Ms. Clark.
I vote yes.
Honourable Ms. Clark votes yes.
Honourable Mrs. Cox.
I vote yes.
Honourable Mrs. Cox votes yes.
Honourable Mr. Eichler.
I vote yes.
Honourable Mr. Eichler votes yes.
Honourable Mr. Iwasko.
I vote yes.
Honourable Mr. Iwasko votes yes.
Honourable Mr. Friesen.
I vote yes.
Honourable Mr. Friesen votes
I
yes.
vote yes.
Honourable Mr. Friesen votes yes.
Honourable Mr. Gerard.
I vote no.
Honourable Mr. Gerard votes no.
Mr. Ginter.
I vote yes.
Mr. Ginter votes yes.
Honourable Mrs. Guimard.
I vote yes.
Honourable Mrs. Guimard votes yes.
Honourable Mr. Helwer.
I vote yes.
Honourable Mr. Helwer votes yes.
Mr. Isleifson.
I vote yes.
Mr. Islifson votes yes.
Mr. Johnston, Assiniboia.
I vote yes.
Mr. Johnson Assiniboia votes yes.
Mr. Lagasse.
I vote yes.
Mr. Lagasse votes yes.
Mr. Lajimodier.
I vote yes.
Mr. Lajimodier votes yes.
Mr. Lamont.
I vote no.
Mr. Lamont votes no.
Ms. Lamoureux.
I vote no.
Ms. Lamoureux votes no.
Ms. Laughlin.
I vote no.
Ms. Laughlin votes no.
Mr. Malloway.
I vote no.
Mr. Malloway votes no.
Ms. Marcelino.
I vote no.
Ms. Marcelino votes no.
Mr. Martin.
I vote yes.
Mr. Martin votes yes.
Mr. Mikuleski.
I vote yes.
Mr. Mikuleski votes yes.
Ms. Morley Lecomte.
I vote yes.
Ms. Morley Lecomte votes yes.
Mr. Moses.
I vote no.
Mr. Moses votes no.
Ms. Naylor.
I vote no.
Ms. Naylor votes no.
Mr. Nesbitt.
I vote yes.
Mr. Nesbitt votes yes.
Honourable Mr. Peterson,
I vote yes.
Honourable Mr. Peterson votes yes.
Mr. Reyes,
I vote yes.
Mr. Reyes votes yes.
Mr. Sala,
I vote no.
Mr. Sala votes no.
Mr. Sandhu,
I vote no.
Mr. Sandhu votes no.
Mr. Smith Lajimodier,
I vote yes.
Mr. Smith Lajimodier votes yes.
Mrs. Smith Point Douglas,
I vote no.
Mrs. Smith Point Douglas votes no.
Mr. Smook,
I vote yes.
Mr. Smook votes yes.
Mr. Teitzma,
I vote yes.
Mr. Teitzma votes yes.
Mr. Voslev,
I vote no.
Mr. Voslev votes no.
Mr. Wishart,
I vote yes.
Mr. Wishart votes yes.
Mr. Wochuk.
I vote yes.
Mr. Wochuk votes yes. Well done.
Great job.
Yeas 33, nays 21.
The motion is accordingly passed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to announce that the Standing Committee on Social and Economic Development will meet on Monday, May 10th, 2021 at 6 p.m. to consider the following: Bill 71, the Education Property Tax Act, Property Tax Installation Act, Assistance Act, and Income Tax Act amended, and Bill 223, the Spirit Fair Day Act.
It has been announced by the Honourable Government House Leader that in the Standing Committee of Social Economic Development will meet on Monday, May 10th, 2021 at 6 p.m. to consider the following: Bill 71, the Education Property Tax Reduction Act, Property Tax and Installation Assistance Act, and Income Tax Act amended, and Bill 223, the Spirit Bear Day Act. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Could you canvass members to see if it is the will of members to call at 5
Is the will to the House to canvass to call at 5 o'clock? Agreed. The hour being 5 o'clock, the House is adjourned and stands adjourned until Monday, May 10th at 1:30 p.m. And have a good constituency week, everyone.